Hello, everyone out there, and welcome to the 2022 Rebele Symposium. I'm R.B. Brenner. I'm a journalism lecturer at Stanford, and I'm delighted to be joined for today's panel by Georgia Wells of the Wall Street Journal, Will Remus of the Washington Post, and my faculty colleague, Jeff Hancock, a professor in the Department of Communication. This symposium is made possible by the generosity of Roland and Pat Rebele, whose financial support is vital to our department. We have two great examples of that this evening. When Georgia was an undergraduate, she received a Rebele internship, which allowed her to work at the Palo Alto Weekly in the summer and fall of 2010. And when Will was an undergraduate, he did a Rebele internship at the San Jose Mercury News in the summer of 2004. For more than 30 years, the Rebele journalism internships have been an incredible springboard for our students. And I know that a number of students in the audience today are excited about taking advantage of that this summer. So again, to Roland and Pat Rebele, thank you. The theme of this year's symposium is covering Facebook, specifically the recent reporting by the Journal and then by a consortium of news organizations, including the Post, based on a trove of internal company documents. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll get into the key findings of those series. One of the most significant takeaways is that Facebook privately tracked and studied real-world harms exacerbated by its platforms, and then, in many instances, ignored, downplayed, or suppressed the results of that research when it proved to be awkward or troubling. I want to mention to our audience that if you have questions, and I hope you do, you can use the Q&A function of this webinar, and I'll be checking that, and we're going to leave plenty of time for audience questions. So Georgia, I'd like you to help us set the table. Georgia, as I mentioned, holds bachelor's and master's degrees from Stanford and has been a San Francisco-based reporter for the Journal for almost a decade now. You've done a lot of reporting on social media, but Facebook was not your beat. Can you tell us first how the Journal began the work that became known as the Facebook Files and how you came to join that reporting team?
Sure. So my colleague, Jeff Horowitz, we owe everything to him. He sent the LinkedIn message of all LinkedIn messages, basically. He reached out to a bunch of employees at Facebook on a certain team that he'd been really interested in learning more about. And I think unbeknownst to him at the time, that team was getting shut down. And a couple of weeks after he sent the messages, one employee replied. And that employee became the Facebook whistleblower. And that's, she's revealed herself as Frances Haugen. And so Jeff, with his sourcing, kind of was talking a lot with Frances, and over the coming months, I think he comes into these documents. At that point, I get pulled in because it was very clear looking at the documents that teens, and in particular teen girls, and their mental health was going to be a focus of it. And I'd done some interviewing with teen girls. And so kind of from that point forward for the next while, kind of teen girls and teen mental health became my focus. And yeah, so.
Great. So Will holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Stanford, a master's from Columbia. He joined the Washington Post in June of 2021 in the role of a technology news analysis writer. So after the Journal series ran, can you tell us, Will, how the Washington Post and you specifically then got involved with this?
Yeah, first I was really jealous of the great reporting by the folks at the Journal, and we all read it. And my colleagues who were on the beat started digging to see what they could find. Could they figure out who the whistleblower is? What can they report out on their own? But in my role as an analysis writer, I was kind of freed to write about the Journal's reporting. And so I read all the Journal reports and did a piece for the Post that just tried to sort of synthesize, like, what are a couple headline takeaways here? And my sort of first bite at that was that there's something interesting about a company that puts so much resources into studying the impacts of its products, including the harms, and then ultimately decides not to do anything about it in a lot of cases. And so I tried to look a little bit into the company's organizational structure. I had also been reading a book about Facebook by a couple of New York Times reporters, and that talked about Sheryl Sandberg and just the leaders of the company and how they think about things and how their decision-making process works. And so I drew on the fact that in many of these stories, and the journals was probably the most the most resonant, but there have been many stories over the years where something comes out that Facebook had studied or that Facebook knew and decided not to act on, or not to act in the sort of ethical way. And some of the recurring figures in that were some of the key policymakers at Facebook. So I just looked at the organizational structure of the company and compared it to Twitter and a couple others. And
Jeff, you bring a different vantage point to this panel. Can you first talk about your own history with Facebook in terms of you study Facebook, you've done collaboration, and how that experience shapes the way you look at a journalism project like this that then lands in the public's consciousness?
Happy to. You'd think I'd have Zoom figured out 2 years in. So yeah, I'll just say, join you, RB. Thank you so much, Georgia and Will. Great being here with you. And yes, so my research group studies how social media affects individuals. So the way we live our lives, how we interact with other people. And so Facebook obviously been a huge part of that for a long time. And we do a lot of studies that involve people using Facebook and related platforms to live their lives. And in 2014, we published a paper in conjunction with Facebook that became really infamous, and that's the emotional contagion study, the Facebook emotional contagion study. And it became infamous because it was a study that showed that people, these platforms conduct experiments on their users to try to understand, as Will was saying, what may be the harms. The original idea behind that paper is they wanted to ensure that it wasn't creating the newsfeed wasn't creating harm through something called social comparison effects. So we looked at that. So the findings themselves weren't the controversy. It was the fact that these companies do A/B tests and without informing people. And in 2014, that was sort of like unknown. I think most people now realize that there's these algorithms and the different versions of the algorithms that are being continuously tested. So that's been my background with them. And I've actually had good relationships with people at Facebook. And I realized, listening to Will, that, and also after this came out, that, I was really shocked and angered, to be quite honest, by these. Here we're doing work, it's taxpayer funded, public work. We're publishing things about this all the time. And here's this company that's got some of my students, many Stanford students, Cornell students, really talented people, 800 really talented researchers, and as Will was saying, ignoring them. And I came to realize, because it created a lot of dissonance for me. Why is it whenever I'm working with people at Facebook or talking to them, they're people that seem to care, they genuinely want to make a good product for people. And then this comes out, and it's, as Will was saying, that you have this amazing, huge research group that just is not being listened to in some cases by other parts of the organizations that ultimately make the decision. So I feel a bit naive saying that, but it was a real learning moment for me.
So I think one of the things that's hard for news consumers these days is to try to discern what is actually revelatory and what is sort of confirming what we sort of think we know, particularly for a company like Facebook that's covered a lot. So I'd like to ask each of you to just try to take a swing at that, of try that balance between, wow, we didn't know this and it's really important to know, versus we always suspected this and now the documents sort of prove it. So let me start with Will, and I'll go to Georgia and then Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, that was a question that kept coming up, right? Because the reaction from people who have followed Facebook closely for years when these stories started coming out is, oh, that's, we've always known that, or we've suspected that, but first of all, there's a difference between knowing something and suspecting something, right? Second of all, there's a difference between outsiders arguing that something is the case, or trying to show that something is the case, and then getting inside documents that show that the company knew it was the case. But then I think, to me, one of the biggest takeaways was that it matters, like, it matters how something comes to light, and if it comes to light in a way that resonates with the average person who doesn't follow the company closely. So it almost doesn't matter like whether some of the findings were known by real insiders. It was this sort of awakening moment for a lot of more casual observers who didn't know this stuff. And so, in that sense, it almost doesn't matter. It reminded me of Cambridge Analytica, which was one of the first big scandals for Facebook. I guess in the lineage that included that study Jeff was part of. But Cambridge Analytica was bigger than that. And it was like the scandal was basically that it was just what company policy was for years. I mean, for years, Facebook just let third-party developers have access to any data they could get from Facebook's users via these integrations, and that wasn't controversial. It was like known by everybody. It was in the rules. But all of a sudden, Cambridge Analytica happens, and it's tied to, well, maybe it helped Trump win the election, and the people who did it were really sketchy, and some additional elements that just caught the popular interest and imagination. And so this thing that had been, these policies that had been known, all of a sudden were a scandal. And I don't think that invalidates the importance of the scandal. I just think it shows the gap between how we perceive, how insiders might perceive something at the time, and then how it looks in retrospect when presented along with some of the harms to the public.
Georgia, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with everything Will was outlining. I think, the only thing I'd add is that the document showed this gulf between how Facebook was discussing these problems externally and how executives discussed these same problems internally. Because, yes, all of these topics had been reported on before, and smart people all over the world had been looking into them. But for example, in the story about the teen girls, in the past, when Mark Zuckerberg and other executives had been asked about teen mental health, they'd often pointed to outside research that their own researchers had not conducted that found little correlation between social media use and depression. Or at other times, their answers had to do with, there's not a consensus among outside researchers. But then we get these documents and we read that at that same time, internally, Facebook executives appeared to have come to a conclusion where using causal language about the effect that their platforms could have on teenagers. And so that was this moment where we're reading in the documents being like, wait a second, this is the same time that executives were testifying and saying, oh, it's complicated. Whereas internally, there's that line that I keep on coming back to, we make body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teen girls. That is not a statement that, is about kind of leaning into the complexity. That's a statement that, their own executives are using causal language.
And Jeff, so when you talk to your students after this work comes out, how do you look at it as its value in your world?
Well, really similar to Georgia. So one area that we look at is well-being. We've done a lot of reviews and meta-analyses about this. And exactly what Georgia says, outside independent research, which is limited in many ways because we don't have the data and the infrastructure that Facebook has, there was no consensus. In fact, there was a debate between a number of different scholars looking even at the same data sets where does it matter, does it not? And it really was not clear. And so what to me that was really upsetting, upsetting, I think is the best word, was that they had data. The other thing is, I have students that are working there. These are people that, have a PhD, say from Stanford, same kind of value system that we've, got here where we want to make things better. And they were doing some of the related work on this and it gets ignored. And so I think here, the more I hear from students, people that are in the industry now, I think that Facebook will have a really hard time hiring these really top flight researchers. This is bad on multiple levels. It's not just bad for Facebook, it's bad for everybody, because now those people that were at least there trying to figure out issues and harms like Georgia was laying out, just won't be there. And so I worry about the long-term aspect of this, although that's the price you pay when you undermine and ignore your own researchers.
So I want to turn to the journalism ethics part of this. Stories that involve internal documents, whether it's from a government agency, obviously like the Pentagon Papers, or from a company, it can be very, very powerful. But it also presents some real ethical challenges for the reporters and editors who get the material, starting with just verifying that it's actually completely authentic, but that's just a starting point. So I'm going to ask Georgia and Will to walk us through. Georgia, take us inside the journal as you try to look at, like, okay, we've got this stuff. It seems obviously newsworthy, but there's a lot of things we need to sort through here.
So we could see who at Facebook had worked on these projects. So from a reporting stance, that gave us this, it was like a plan for how to go about verifying. So we could contact current and former employees who'd worked on these topics to be, to say like, hey, this is our understanding so far. What are we missing? Or what's important? What don't I have right? Or what's important for us to understand here? So that just, having the names of all these employees was like a huge, tremendous benefit to doing that.
Yep.
Or the other ethical issue was also around the teen girls, but maybe we could also get back. We could get back to that later?
No, go ahead. I think that's
the other issue was like many stories about teens often don't actually quote teens themselves, and so we really clearly wanted to hear from teens about their experiences. But the challenge here was that for a lot of these teens who've experienced these issues, it's body image issues, eating disorders, anxiety, depression. They're all like really heavy topics. So the last thing we wanted to do was exacerbate these issues for any of the teenagers. So I spent weeks contacting teenagers and therapists and teachers in different ways to find teenagers who I could speak with who had experienced these issues, but were now in a much better spot. So teenagers who weren't like in immediate risk. And so that was, that took weeks of just like, maybe finding a teenager, but it's like, oh, like this is too raw for them. Like that's not, and then trying to find other teenagers who had actually kind of recovered to a great extent, who'd be able to talk about that journey. So that also kind of took up a huge amount of my brain space during these weeks.
And I'll turn to Will on this, and I guess I'll sort of frame it a little bit as the question of context too. So like, deciding are these documents representative? What's being left out? And so talk about that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, some of the pushback from within Facebook as these stories started coming out was like, well, look, this is just some of our researchers' opinion, man. Like they were, they kind of poo-pooed some of the slide decks and said, well, these are just junior researchers, and you can't, just because they put in a presentation doesn't mean that that's the definitive truth. And I mean, there's something to that. I mean, these are teams of humans, and just because they worked at Facebook doesn't mean that they have godlike access to every kind of data you would want, or every kind of experiment or study you would want. The Instagram teen girls, and Georgia, I defer to you on the details of this, but that was mostly a self-reported study by users about how things made them feel. It's not a peer-reviewed paper. And so there is that question of like, there's a temptation, I think, when we uncover documents that are internal documents to assume that they're damning, that this is sort of the final word. And Facebook wanted to, I think it went a little far in the other direction, maybe like, oh no, these are just some ideas that some of our researchers had, but I think that, the truth is somewhere in the middle. But I think it was important as we reported on these to try to contextualize, which was again hard to do because these are documents that were not public at the time. There were concerns in terms of making the documents public because you would want to go through a really lengthy process of redacting people's private information or anything that could be a privacy concern. So yeah, that was certainly something I think a lot of the outlets thought about as we reported on this. And then there was one additional weird journalism ethics thing that came up for us at the Post is, the Journal broke the story first. And then my colleague, Kat, our tech policy reporter at the Post, tracked down, got in touch with Frances Haugen, was one of a few outlets who got in touch with her and her team before she went public as the whistleblower on 60 Minutes. And then, over time, this list of publications that were getting the documents from Frances and the people she was working with grew and grew. And so, now we're in this thing that became called the consortium of publications that are all combing through the documents, all working on the same embargo. And so it's really weird as a journalism outlet that we were like, it's like, are we colluding with our rival publications here by agreeing to this embargo? Agreeing to these terms, and there were all these negotiations back and forth between editors at different publications who normally would never talk to each other about what we're covering. So I don't want to speak to that too much because I wasn't firsthand involved in it, but it was a weird side effect. And it was because Frances was the whistleblower, was a very savvy operator herself, and she also reached out to very savvy operators, PR, professional PR operations, people who have been in this world, been on Capitol Hill, who know how to work with the media. So a lot of it was, was somewhat stage managed. And so there was the question of, are we being stage managed here, and how do we avoid that in covering these leaked documents?
Yeah, let me ask a quick follow on that. My colleague, Janine Zakaria in the journalism program, has done some really great work in the aftermath of the Russians' hack of the DNC email. And Janine has put together essentially a playbook for newsrooms that when you're getting material, it's not just the veracity of the material and not just the newsworthiness, but also evaluating the source of the information, the motives of the information, and in some cases, how much the readers need to know about that as well as what's in the documents. And I know later on, Facebook tried to spin her somewhat as, a Democratic, if not operative or aligned. So how do the two journalists in the panel think about that? Like if there's this period, you get these documents, you probably have to agree to anonymity to get the documents, but then you're in a way in violation of sort of Janine's principle here.
I think from the journals, or at least from my perspective, the documents were so exhaustive. And then we had this opportunity, we had this reporting period to go to the people who had worked on the teams and to ask them my back pocket journalism question all the time is, what are we missing here? Like, what else is at play? What else should we be aware of? And over again, we heard from employees who had worked on these issues, like, no, you've got the relevant studies. Like, yes, this is,
No, but I think the issue there more is there's a period where the audience doesn't know the other side of it, which is how you came upon the material and the motivation of the person who provided it.
So my colleague Jeff wrote a profile of Frances and her thought process and her kind of just decision to bring these documents forward and reveal her identity. And that story came out, I think it was a couple of days after we ran just the first series. Mm-hmm. And so I hope for most readers that kind of gave them like the tools and the facts to be able to kind of make their own determinations about kind of what's going on here. Like, why did she come forward? And in the story, Jeff talks about how she had worked at Facebook and she'd gotten there. She'd arrived kind of really excited to make the world a better place, and that she grew kind of disillusioned. And so by what she saw at the company. And so I think that was important for readers to understand her perspective when she chose to walk out of the company with all these documents.
Jeff, you and I had a conversation a few days ago, and one of the questions you asked, and I sort of wrote it down, so I'm going to read your words back. And the question was, how do you communicate research about social media in journalism that isn't alarmist? So, what grabs the headline, but at the same time isn't so breathless, I guess.
Yeah, and I think we have two great journalists on here that deal with that all the time and deal with it well. The word I have is similar to what we find with algorithms and social media, which is the sort of like really upsetting, negative, high arousal kind of information. Algorithms figure out, they detect that that's things that people pay attention to. And psychologically, we know that if something negative happens in our environment, we kind of automatically attend to it. And, journalists have known this forever, right? There's the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads. And so one thing I've found frustrating about how, social media, in particular, social media research has covered, is that there's this emphasis on the negative. And Georgia did this, I thought, really carefully. And even with the Facebook studies, right? If there is a third of the young women in their study are reporting these harms, there's the 2/3, in that particular study that are getting either, no harm or some benefit out of it. And so how do journalists, but also the people that are doing the research and being interviewed about, how do we talk about with some sort of like way of not freaking parents out, but also not ignoring the potential harms for some children? I just don't know how to find that balance yet. I worry that it leads to parents being worried about things they don't need to and not worrying about things that they should. And that children end up being anxious using a tool that society in many ways makes them use, right? Like my students can't do their class without using online technology. I mean, that's just the way modern higher education is. And so if we're telling them it's bad for them, and then also here you must use this, what are we doing? And so that's the worry that I really have, and I don't have an answer for.
Yeah, why don't I let Georgia and Will share thoughts on that?
One of the most striking aspects of the reporting, and I think if I can't remember which draft and what ended up in the final product, but for sure many of the teen girls told me that they didn't want Instagram to go away. They wanted to continue using it, and they drew, certain benefits. And so one of the anecdotes I included was she's actually a Stanford student, Sylvia Colt-Lacayo. She talked about her experience on Instagram. She uses a wheelchair, and when she first logged on as a 12 or 13-year-old, I can't remember her exact age, she had this negative experience of not seeing other teenagers in wheelchairs and seeing all these teenagers doing there weren't other teenagers in wheelchairs who were having positive experiences on the apps, and that was really negative for her. And then years later, she had kind of proactively customized her experience and found a community of disabilities activists and people with disabilities who were just like posting about their day-to-day lives, and that actually really improved her life. So including that story in this article was like an important way of showing like, no, this is not every single teenager is having this terrible, life-altering, awful experience. Like, here's a teenager, now she's in her 20s, but who had a really powerful experience. The other thing is we had a chunk of time between when I started doing these interviews and when we published. And so I took that time to talk to a lot of parents about some of the high-level findings in vague terms, to gut check what were things that they wanted to know more about. And so we used that to guide kind of the prioritization of the information we included in the article. It was basically like the types of items where like I'd start, hey, our understanding is we believe Facebook has this research that shows blah, blah, blah. And when parents were like, wow, I want to know more about that, I was like, okay, we'll put that high in the story. But I don't know the best answer to that, but that was just how we approached kind of fear mongering versus kind of like information people have a right to know or want to know.
Will, any add on that?
Yeah, this is something I thought about a lot, especially as I started digging into the documents as well and writing about them. And I think I saw that Ted Glasser, Professor Emeritus, might be in the audience. Hi, Ted. I was reminded of Ted's class that I took when I was an undergrad at Stanford, where he was talking, I don't remember even the context, but he was talking about how a lot of the best investigative journalism is done by reporters who are in a sort of mode of crusading. They're on a crusade, like they've found something wrong and they're going to expose it, and they're going to highlight the harms, because that's what the job, that's the muckraking tradition, right? And I think that there is absolutely value in that, and I think that a lot of the pieces in the journal series and in our own coverage and other publications coverage fit into that mode, right? Like, we found bad stuff. Here's why it's bad. Here's why it's a big deal. I think there is also, I think that's why it's important to also have, a sort of a second media apparatus who's, that analyzes what, okay, here's a lot of bad stuff that's been publicized. What do we really make of this? There were some interesting articles. Are there upsides, for mental health for teen girls of being on Instagram? I wrote a story from the Facebook documents about the algorithm, about the use of the angry, the reaction emojis. So Facebook's algorithm at one point, they used to just have likes and comments and clicks to evaluate how people responded to a given story, and then decide who else to show that story to in the newsfeed. At one point, they introduced reaction emojis, and now they had finer grained data on how people are reacting to a story. And one of the decisions they made early on is that when people react with an emoji instead of a like, they're going to treat that as a 5 times more important signal that this story resonated and show it to more people for that reason. Well, it wasn't just the angry emoji that did this. I mean, all the reaction emojis, if you use a reaction emoji, that got 5 times the weight in the algorithm of a simple like. Our story highlighted the anger emoji because frankly, because that's the one that the integrity researchers at Facebook highlighted. That was the one they were concerned about. They were able to they found research linking the angry emoji to some of this very kind of content that they were trying to stop, making go viral, right? Hateful content, divisive content, toxic content of all kinds was more likely to generate an angry emoji. They said, well, why are we giving that 5 times the weight? So, we wrote the story that really focused on that angry emoji, but I think we got some very fair pushback from people. First of all, the story, did really well. It got a good reception, but we also got some fair pushback from people who were saying, well, look, your headline, in the story, we gave all the context, but your headline made it look like it was just the angry emoji that was worth 5 times a like, and it made it look worse than it actually was. I think there's a fair criticism, something that we struggled with in writing the story and afterward.
I'm going to stay with you, Will, and talk about a piece you wrote on September 16th. And it tried to address the why of all of this. So essentially, why would Facebook go through the trouble to study the harms and then not act to mitigate them once they were known? And you offered this hypothesis, and I'm going to quote from your story and then have you talk about it. So I'm quoting now. Unlike some rivals, Facebook routes weighty decisions about content policy through some of the same executive tasked with government lobbying and public relations, an arrangement that critics say creates a conflict of interest. And you mentioned in particular Joel Kaplan and Nick Clegg. So why don't you talk a bit more about that problem?
Yeah, so when covering these documents, we tend to sort of gloss Facebook as one entity, right? Facebook knew that it was bad for, that Instagram was bad for teens, or Facebook knew that, the angry emoji was linked to hateful content and didn't change it until, for 3 years or whatever. But, of course, Facebook isn't just one entity, it's a gigantic company, and not everything that is known at the level of, say, the head of the integrity team or their boss makes it up to the level of Sheryl Sandberg or Mark Zuckerberg. Certainly Zuckerberg and Sandberg set the tone, for the people under them, and they set the norms. What kind of stuff do you bring to them? How much ammo do you have to have if you want to make the case for a change that might impact growth or revenue? That's stuff that absolutely the buck stops with them. But there are, a lot of the findings that we were reporting on probably never made it to that level. And I think one reason for that, based on my reporting, is that to get to that level of Mark and Sheryl, they had to go up through a chain of command that included people whose primary responsibilities were managing Facebook's relationships on Capitol Hill and managing Facebook's relationships with the press and the public. I mean, that's, Nick Clegg's #1 job is public relations. Joel Kaplan's #1 job is keeping Washington appeased and making sure that neither the Democrats or the Republicans are going to fully turn on Facebook. And so that's their prime directive. And so when people came to them saying, hey, our researchers have this great stuff on how the angry emoji is causing more hate speech, more divisive content, but if we turn it off, it's going to hurt growth by this much. And also, it's actually going to downgrade right-leaning content more than left-leaning content. Somebody like Kaplan sees that and says, that's not going to fly, but it's not. And then maybe it never makes it to Zuckerberg. So I want to be clear that I'm speaking in sort of hypotheticals here in terms of I don't know what information made it to what level, but I think certainly that organizational structure does not lend itself to that kind of research being taken seriously at the highest level of the company, even when it's good research.
Georgia, I want to talk about when the journal story started to be published, Facebook's reaction. And that, from what I understand, it evolved. It was like, tried this and then tried that. Can you walk us through that process?
Yeah, Facebook's reaction was quite a roller coaster. Obviously, we went through all of the points that pertain to Facebook with them to get their perspective, their response. Initially, and you can see this in the article, Facebook's response focused more around the ideas of, yes, our research has found potential harms to a certain portion of teenagers. To be sure, this, that's only one metric. There's also other aspects that teenagers report, improvements in their lives. And I think the article reflected that. Then after the stories came out, hold on, it twists and turns a bit, hold on. So after the stories came out, Facebook for a time started pushing a different narrative that, if issues only affected a small subset of users. And I think for many of the reporters who were reporting at that time, the takeaway appeared to be that, like, because it's a small subset, thus it shouldn't matter as much. And I think the main pushback to that argument that I saw getting reported was, actually there are lots of topics that only affect subsets of populations, take, for instance, racism. And, just because something only affects a subset of a population doesn't typically make an issue less worthy of scrutiny. So then a couple days after the story came out, Facebook came up with their first blog post about the story. And this blog post was about kind of the series that the journal had done. And in that blog post, they said that to suggest that the research community is settled in its view on the intersection between social media and well-being is simply not the case. That response was sort of a head scratcher because the article did not assert that the research community was settled on its view of this intersection between social media and well-being. I think it appeared that Facebook was attempting to kind of push reporters to write on something only when a consensus, after an issue has been litigated, when in fact the purpose of this article was to report to readers what Facebook was finding internally, as messy as that can be. Then, another couple days later, Facebook came out with another blog post. This time they framed this as a point counterpoint. So people who haven't seen these before, typically a point counterpoint framing is used when there's factual inaccuracies, when you say this is asserted, in fact, this is wrong. What was amusing is Facebook uses this point counterpoint framing. But they never actually dispute any of the facts in the story. So they use this framing to kind of dispute the emphasis. And again, they were leaning on the idea that the research found that some of the topics for teens could actually improve when they used Instagram. And, but that was included in the story already by that point. Then a few days later, we contacted Facebook again and told them that we planned to publish some of the documents because we'd heard from so many readers and lawmakers that, that people really seemed to think these underlying documents were going to be really newsworthy. So that made sense. And so we spent time redacting the documents to take out the personal, the identifying information for the people who worked on the projects. And so we're working on that. And half an hour after we asked Facebook for comment, they published 2 of the documents. They front run us, published 2 of the documents. So then a couple hours after that, we published 5 of the slide decks. And the crazy part here was the most interesting slide deck, hands down, was called Teen Girls Body Image and Social Comparison on Instagram. Facebook didn't publish that slide deck. And then they annotated their slide decks basically kind of drawing emphasis that like the researchers themselves hadn't believed, important at the time. So yeah, that brings us to where we are now. It's been a lot.
Yeah. Jeff, you seem sort of eager to jump in on this, so I'm going to read your body language.
One thing we can do on Zoom. Yeah, this has been fascinating to listen to, because I had that exact same question that Will was addressing, which is like, why would you invest, hundreds of millions of dollars in this research, and then ignore it? And especially, to George's point, a small subset of any Facebook level population is a large number of people, and to then not take this seemed like an amazing opportunity. Hey, let's see if we can figure out how to improve it for this subgroup, which is just the rational way to go about doing this. It gets ignored. And so I've always really been flabbergasted ever since these stories came out. So Will's insights there make a lot of sense. I watched the slides come out that Georgia was talking about too, and I was infuriated. And I know many of the researchers that work at Facebook were, because these researchers are not producing research that's going to go to a journal for peer publication. Their job is to inform the product team of issues that they're seeing. And they do that with informal language. They're not using super scientific language, right? So they could speak causally about a self-report, non-representative, non-experiment sample, because they're trying to communicate directly with their product team. And so then for what was clearly a very high level group of, lead researchers, clearly senior researchers, come in and then sort of show all the limits, mistakes, etc., as if they were judging it for peer review, was just undercutting their whole enterprise. So that was infuriating. Yes, okay, sure, it's self-report. Thanks for pointing out they're not writing to a journal. So to me, it was just hugely missed opportunity, and that led to harm. That these young women that were reporting the harms they were feeling, you can't ignore that. And they did.
So I'm going to ask a couple that are just sort of jump ball questions. You can just sort of raise your hand and jump in. And this involves the reaction from Congress in specific. I mean, obviously there's regulators possibly at state levels, but this clearly seems to have gotten the attention of Congress. So my first question is, there was some pretty embarrassing stuff. I don't remember how many years back when Mark Zuckerberg was testifying and Orrin Hatch was questioning him. So I guess number one is, has the Senate in particular sort of progressed here, or is Congress pretty incapable of even taking this stuff on, and will they, more likely to create more of a mess than not? So that's kind of the first question for the group. Will, maybe I'll let you start it. I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just thinking I have a couple of colleagues who could answer this question better than I can, because they're on the Hill every day covering tech policy. I think that one of the big things we saw to come out of the Facebook files and the Haugen documents in particular was a sudden interest in regulating algorithms. So Haugen had worked on, she was a product manager, she had worked on social media algorithms at previous companies. She had a lot of experience with how they work, with what they optimize for, with the ways that algorithms can be tweaked to increase, drive up metrics that you want to drive up, and then with the ways that can be ethically dicey. Maybe you're driving up the growth metric and you're also driving up harms for a subset of the population. Congress, I think Congress, for some of the folks who heard her testimony, it was the first time they felt like they really understood the problem with engagement-based algorithms. And so there was a whole little bevy of proposals of bills that came in the following weeks that were around transparency of algorithms, that were around, they were trying to find ways, can we make them go back to a reverse chronological timeline? Are all algorithms evil? Are they good? Then are the good algorithms we're going to be throwing out? But I think, and there's a lot more than just the algorithmic side of things. I mean, there's the privacy and data mining side that Congress is interested in, although not as interested as perhaps they should be. There's the antitrust side, which is the one, I mean, in terms of what actually has some momentum on the Hill right now that's substantive, it's really antitrust. And that didn't come out of the Haugen hearings. That came out of a separate investigation by a House committee, and Lena Khan was on the staff there, and now she's in the Biden administration. The antitrust thing is, actually has some bipartisan momentum behind it. Anything that comes out, and this is my opinion, I'm willing to be contradicted here by Jeff or Georgia, but I think anything that comes out of the Haugen testimony and the Haugen documents in particular is likely to take much longer, because Congress is just starting to get their heads around the idea of how social media outlets measure, understand their harms, measure their harms, weigh them against growth, how algorithms play a role in that, all that kind of stuff. I think we're pretty far off. That some of the proposals, I've talked to scholars who think they run into First Amendment concerns. When you're regulating a company's ability to write algorithms, are you regulating their speech in a way? Are you regulating their ability to make editorial decisions? There's the whole Section 230 stuff. I mean, there's a lot of nuances to that. So I just think we're a ways off from action. Also, the fact that Congress can't do anything anyway. So
let me go to Georgia and Jeff briefly on thoughts on that same question. Georgia?
Yeah. So basically, having called a bunch of Capitol Hill type folks for the past couple months, the takeaway from them was that the aspect of the Facebook files that has the greatest likelihood of there being bipartisan support for some aspect of legislation is around the teens and the kids. And the reason for that is, Will was mentioning the Section 230 Section 230, like questions around misinformation, disinformation, that often becomes this free speech lightning rod in Congress. For the kids and the teenagers, that's something that Republicans and Democrats often can agree on. And so for that, we saw Senators Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut and Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee actually working together. And those are two senators who rarely agree on anything. And so it was pretty striking to, listen to some of their press conferences about their hopes for legislation around protecting teens or kids online for 2022. So this year now. But to Will's point, it's, betting on anything happening in Congress, I don't know what those odds are, but it sounds complicated. But another separate area that we've heard a bit about is Europe. And so some of our European reporters expect Europe to pass more legislation around teens and children in the coming year. So it'll be interesting to watch.
And Jeff?
Yeah, I think, I don't know the legislation part as well, but there's a big missing piece that I think nobody's talking about, which is what do we legislate for? So we know a lot about what is bad. So disinformation is bad, well-being, harm is bad, but what do we want? And I don't think we have a good idea of what digital well-being means. It could be that digital well-being is a form of media that would not be good for these companies, right? That's a possibility, like way less engagement, for example. But it could be that digital well-being could be completely consistent with current business practices, but just done where the users are actually, their well-being is actually put forward. But we don't know what digital well-being actually means or looks like. And until we have some idea what that is, then how do you go about legislating things to make it more like that? How do you develop tools like algorithm audits, which are really technical and difficult, and not many people know how to do them, to actually ensure that the legislation is being followed? So to me, I feel there's actually a really big missing piece, which is what do we want, not what do we not want?
And Will, I know in sort of happier times, you actually had some access to Facebook to sort of peel back the curtain and sort of understand a bit more how the algorithms operate. And can you share that, when that was, what the experience was like? And then I have a follow-up on that.
Yeah, so, it's interesting over time. Facebook's relationship with the press has changed in many ways. I was just listening to Georgia talk about about some of the ways that Facebook responded to this. And sorry, I'm going to digress for just a second. Where, that tactic that Georgia described, that straw man tactic, has become so familiar to me now. It's like a bingo card. So like the Wall Street Journal will report that Facebook had different tiers of moderation intensity for different countries or different regions. And then Facebook will come out with something where they say, to suggest that we don't care about moderating in developing countries is categorically false. So they'll just like make up something that nobody said so that they can say it's categorically false. And then somebody who's not reading closely, is like, oh, well, Facebook denies it. They say that's not true. Anyway, sorry, going back to like 2015, 2016. I mean, Facebook, this was, it was really, I think, Cambridge Analytica and Trump's election that kind of changed the tide of the relationship between Facebook and the media. And before that, I had a chance in 2015. I was interested in people were starting to talk a lot about algorithms. You would start to see algorithms in headlines, but most people didn't really know what an algorithm was. So I had a story idea like, what is an algorithm? How does Facebook's algorithm, what does it actually do? And I told my contact at Facebook PR about it, and she was like, oh yeah, that's really interesting. And so they ended up inviting me to the Menlo Park campus, and I spent half a day there with their team that works on the algorithm. It's called the Newsfeed Ranking Team. And I got to see what they do. And their head of feed ranking gave me a little seminar on on all the trade-offs and different ways to rank things. And so, I don't know how relevant that is to where we are today with Facebook, but it did help. I think it did help give me a basis over the years to understand some of the stuff like the Haugen documents. It was really interesting to see in the documents some of the Facebook's own integrity researchers talking about some of the issues that are like, they were raising questions that I had just naively raised in that meeting in 2015 with their ranking team. Like, well, what if you're optimizing for this, isn't there a concern that you're also optimizing for sensationalism or for just pandering to people's cognitive biases, feeding them confirmation bias because that's what they're going to hit like on, is that a concern? And but at the time it was sort of like a philosophical conversation. They're like, oh, that's interesting, Anyway, but I'll let somebody else talk.
Well, I'll ask a follow to that, and the follow is that as artificial intelligence, machine learning has entered the equation more and more, does Facebook itself even have the ability to completely control its algorithm? Jeff, maybe start on that.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the most complicated algorithms or systems, we know of, right? So you're getting hundreds of billions of inputs, social inputs from humans in a day. And then the system is making hundreds of billions of decisions about what content to then show to, a billion or two people. So it's just incredibly complex. I don't know. I mean, I know the people that helped develop the news feed at the time, it was just like Will was saying, they were computer scientists and they had not thought about all these social issues that could come up. They're like, oh, that's interesting. They were just sort of like winging it and creating a product that people really, really wanted to use. And I think that's been sort of an MO. Build it, and then something happens. Okay, we'll try and address it. And so Will's description is very similar to what my experience has been. I think it's just incredibly complicated. I don't know where Facebook's understanding it is, but there is no one algorithm, right? We probably all have very different algorithms, all serving us different kinds of things, and it's incredibly complicated. And that's just another thing that makes legislating anything in this space just incredibly difficult.
I want to pause for a second and invite the audience to put your questions in the Q&A function, because I want to get to as many of your questions as possible. So now's the time to sort of load up that Q&A. Georgia, you've covered many of the major social media companies. From your experience, are there a few things that are just sort of defining about Facebook or Meta that are quite different from Twitter and Google and others?
I'll stick to the like experience of teens and teen girls, since that has been just like my like overwhelming emphasis for the past year. Mm-hmm. But what was interesting to me talking to so many teens and teen girls and reading the research was that different product decisions can just like invoke very, very different experiences. So the issue on Instagram was this issue called negative social comparison. And that's this issue where someone's looking through their news feed, and rather than looking at it in terms of like trying to learn about who are these people in my news feed, they kind of approach it with this mindset of, wow, how do I stand up next to these people in my news feed? And often when people experience negative social comparison, it will have to do with things of, I feel so much less beautiful or successful or powerful or wealthy, or they have an amazing relationship, or all, amazing house, all of these different things that people can stack themselves up against. And on Instagram, Facebook's own researchers found that on Instagram, negative social comparison is worse on Instagram than on other platforms. And so Instagram, like, they've got these quantified likes that really breed this perfectionism. Right now on TikTok, for example, something I've been looking into is how TikTok appears to instead really reward shock and controversy. And on TikTok's algorithm, it's, engagement based and putting the most sticky, engaging stuff at the very top of your feed and the stuff that you might watch more. And it's less about racking up these views and like counts. And just over the past couple of days, spending too many hours on these platforms, it's just like really remarkable to me, like just like these, they're different apps, but they have slightly different design decisions. And like, wow, one of them and also talking to so many teen girls, they walk away from TikTok feeling like, oh my goodness, like the world is in flames, everyone is mad at each other. And on TikTok, on Instagram, many of the teen girls would log off with this feeling of like, oh my goodness, I'm not popular enough. And so it's just like, those were two of the examples. Snapchat came up a bit in the reporting, and the teens talked about it more from the perspective of at times feeling left out, because Snapchat has this function where you can see on a map where all your friends are. And the pain of seeing on the map that all your friends are apparently in the same location and they didn't tell you. I think that's something that like everyone has experienced, but it's particularly acute for teens at a really like vulnerable time in life to find out from an app that all their friends were hanging out without them. And now I can't even remember what your original question was, or if I'm answering it, but yeah. And Twitter also, Twitter's not huge among the teens I've talked to. Surprisingly, DMing on Twitter is quite big for some of them, which surprised me. Facebook, they don't tend to use very much. What else? Yeah, those are the main. Oh, YouTube, many of the teens describe, spending copious amounts of time using YouTube, consuming it, but a lot less time posting. And so just like having less of that kind of interactive experience.
So I'm going to go to Will and Jeff on another question, and then Georgia. The first one in the Q&A is going to be for you. And the question for Will and Jeff is to talk about how much of a recruiting problem this poses for Meta. I just know when I first came to Stanford in 2010, if there was a Facebook recruiting event, students flocked to it. And I get the sense we're sort of in a different moment. Jeff, why don't you start, and then I'll go to Will.
Yeah, certainly. I think right around 2017, Cambridge Analytica is when I first started hearing students be like, I think I'm going to go to X, Y, or Z and not to Facebook. And before that, like Facebook was the place to be. Now, I think it's gotten worse, at least in the research space, where several students I know have left, and they're going to places like Patreon, for example, because they want to get out of spaces where advertising is driving all of the decisions, or where, as George is saying, like it's all about, beauty likes, right? Whereas with other services like Patreon, it's about like, hey, these are creatives and I want to support them. I support what they're doing, not like necessarily how they look or what their life is like. So I do think this is a big problem. Yeah, I really do.
And Will, how about the Meta rebranding, and what's the pitch now?
Yeah, I think it's easy for the public to underestimate the importance of employee sentiment at a company like Facebook, at these tech companies. I had the chance, so I worked, before I started the Post, I worked at a startup publication that was done by Medium, which is fundamentally, you're really a tech company, but they got into the editorial business and launched these publications. They actually had done it before and shut those down, so I wasn't entirely surprised when mine ended up shut down after a year and a half or so. But I got some insight into what tech company culture is like. I mean, the higher ups at companies, obviously Medium was much smaller than Facebook, but the employees increasingly are activists within the company. I mean, they read stuff about their own company and about their product's harms, and it makes them feel crappy, and they let their managers hear about it, and they feel, I think they feel empowered to do so because these are people with, like Stanford engineering degrees, right? They could go anywhere. And so their choice is like, if they're unhappy with stuff that their company is doing, they can stay and fight for change, or they can walk, but they don't need to just stay silent. So employees are a huge force. Losing your employees' faith is a big thing for a company. And so I think that's actually part of what's behind Facebook's big pivot, changing its name to Meta and building the metaverse. I mean, if your pitch to these top computer science graduates and potential product managers and such is like, come here and fix this like disgusting mess of social media and democracy and content moderation, this like unsolvable morass that we've all been slogging through, and everybody's going to hate you no matter what you do. I mean, that's not a very appealing pitch, right? Like maybe they rather go work someplace else. But now it's come here and build the metaverse, build virtual reality, build the next internet. Now you've got the attention potentially of engineering graduates. So I actually think that's underrated. There are always many causes for any big decision like that, but I think that's underrated as one of the drivers of Facebook rebranding itself as a metaverse company.
Okay, I'm going to move to the audience questions. We're going to start with this one initially to Georgia, and then I might ask Will to answer the follow-up. So the question for Georgia is, how did you determine what teenage sources were appropriate to interview and which could be negatively impacted by being interviewed?
So this was hands down one of the hardest kind of things I was working on this year. I started off talking to a therapist about kind of their views. I figured, therapists would have a much closer to the ground and more informed view on this. And many of the therapists were saying it was important to find teenagers who in many ways had recovered and had come out the other side, because that would indicate to their therapist or to their family that they had a toolkit to address these issues if they relapsed. I was in contact with the parents of the teens who I spoke with in case the parents had concerns. And then for the teens themselves, also being really clear that, when participating in a news article, it can be really hard to predict what will happen as a result of it or what will happen next. And I can, warn or tell people about some of the experiences other people have talked to have had, but like, I can't read the future. And so I would preface that because it mattered to me that the teens who we talked to in the article kind of had a sense of why they wanted to participate and what the kind of public benefit in their view might be. And still, I still had tremendous amount of heartburn kind of leading up to the story getting, when it published and in the days and weeks afterwards. And I feel good about it now, but I don't know how to always get that right 100%, with 100% confidence, but it just like, going to the people who knew. So, in this case, therapists and eating disorder doctors, and then talking to the teens who, said, who had agreed to talk about the potential downsides was how I approached this issue.
And then the follow-up I'll address to Will. The follow-up was essentially, how do you as a reporter think about this equation of harm, minimizing harm while also truth-telling?
I'm sorry, I didn't read the question. This is harm specifically to your sources potentially?
Yes, exactly. When you're dealing with particularly unsophisticated sources, in this case, not even adults, minors, all that area.
Yeah, I think that it really tends to be case by case to some degree. I don't think there are a lot of hard and fast rules. In my reporting, I try to remember that there's probably nobody's life that will be more impacted by the story than the sources who are in it. Our first duty obviously is to the reader and to the truth, but I really think that there's a sort of a duty to sources as well, especially, and it's one thing if you're talking about and we're not even talking about sophisticated sources, right? Flax, public officials, we're not talking about that. But if you're talking about just everyday people who are participating in a story, if I wrote something that made them, that made their life worse, that would feel like a bad story to me. I don't ever want that to happen. So I try to just be really upfront with them when I'm talking to them, look, if at any point you're uncomfortable, let's stop, let's zoom out, let's take stock. I'm really much more relaxed in terms of rules about going, I'm okay going off the record. If they say something and then later they're like, that was off the record, I will usually honor that if it's an unsophisticated source, where I wouldn't if that was a politician. So I don't know if this is a very helpful answer, but I just think it is case by case, and I think it matters a lot.
I'm going to address this one to Jeff, and I might ask Carolyn, who asked it, one clarifying question, but the question as written is, as more teens begin making social media profiles on Facebook and Instagram, what role should schools be playing in teens' technology and social media use? And my question for Carolyn, by schools, do you tend to mean pre-college or including a place like Stanford? But I'll let Jeff take that question.
Sure. I actually think it has to be drastically more is the answer. So as of right now, there's zero systematic or programmatic training for kids about social media and typically internet use in general. And yet we know it consumes a large part of their day. They're engaging with it for hours and hours, often in private or with a very small group of either friends or a community they found. And so we're allowing young people to go out and engage with these really sophisticated technologies with almost no training. And I think back to when my dad got his driver's license in Canada, I think he said he had to go in the morning, he drove around for the day, and then he got his license that evening. For me, it was a month. I had to drive with an adult for a month. Now I think in California, it's a year, 2 years of driving. As tools become more sophisticated and potentially more dangerous, we need more education. So yes, we can talk about legislation and tech regulation. We can talk about the economics of it, but there's another piece that we can control, which is the education that we give ourselves and our children. So my lab in particular has turned in this direction really big. There's groups like My Digital Tattoo here in the Valley that do workshops. There's national groups like MediaWise that are trying to build literacy interventions, not only for young people, but older adults that are targeted with disinformation. So I think there's a huge opportunity for us to do kind of like in the 80s, we're we need to teach everybody how, basics of statistics. The same kind of push to do that we need for how to use technology in a safe way for yourself.
Georgia, this is an audience question for you. And the question is, what is it like having to spend hours on social media for your reporting? Has it impacted your mental health and well-being? And before you answer that, I should add, because I know you and I talk quite often, that you had also done a lot of reporting, I guess in the last year or so, on the dark web and 4chan and 8chan, and that was a very difficult experience. So maybe if you could share some of that as well.
Yeah, so it definitely, I feel like maybe a year or two ago, I'd say, no, it doesn't affect me at all. But I'm like, no, I think it does affect me. So one of the tools I use is to, so I have versions of some of the kind of websites that deal more in hate that I can access without images. And so I find that that's a lot less triggering for me, is to read through the comments. And if I actually want to reveal a photo, then I can. but I find that a lot easier to just like cope with rather than like, you know, swastika after swastika or like things like that on websites. And then on the apps are a lot harder for, like, I haven't come up with a really great workaround for avoiding kind of negative content. In a lot of ways, it's my job to encounter this content and write about it. You know, therapy is a great thing, let me tell everybody. But I've also found that talking to researchers who study these issues and teens who've also experienced it, that like understanding the mechanisms that happen with apps, I found to be really, really helpful to understand like why certain content can make you spiral, or to understand why certain content can make you feel inadequate. And I think that speaks to the education aspect that Jeff was referring to, that, you know, sometimes like, you know, learning about how something works, it doesn't always make it completely better, but knowing that like, this is why, you know, certain apps can elicit negative social comparison helped me better than identify what was happening, log off, and remind myself that like, oh, like I actually feel pretty good about my life. And like just being able to see that happen and then take a break was really helpful. And then I've also experimented some with like a lot of the time spent and take a break features, partly from a reporting interest, but also partly from, you know, I'm human too, and sometimes spend too much time on apps perspective. So I'll be interested to see, you know, what I make of them.
And if audience members have additional questions, now's the time to jump in. Jeff, tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe one of your, maybe a group of your doctoral students at one point were looking into a project about trying to provide more support for the people who are hired by the companies to spend, that's their job, to spend all day essentially looking at horrible things. Am I correct on that? And maybe you can share a little bit of the thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Two related projects, but one is I can't remember if it was George or Will was talking about moderation is this gigantic, huge issue. In some ways, like the core thing about social media platforms is they have to moderate the content that goes on. And you know, tens of thousands of people are hired, and many of them have to be exposed to the worst of humanity. And so as Georgia was experiencing, it can get pretty horrible. And those people are seeing those and, you know, having to make decisions whether to remove them or not. And we wanted to, you know, provide some resources to help them in many of the kind of ways that Georgia just sort of was naturally learning to do that. There are techniques that you can use to stay healthy online. And so another project that's being led by a PhD student here, Angela Lee, is around mindsets about social media. So in the same way we have mindsets about education, like if you think your brain and intelligence is like a muscle, you work harder, you train it. If you think it's fixed, then you avoid dangerous situations. So it turns out having one mindset's better from an education point of view than another. And so what Angela's finding is that people that feel like they have agency, like they're in control of their social media, have a better experience with it. They, like Georgia was experiencing, they know, oh, wait a minute, I'm feeling some weird social comparison with this influencer, and I don't want that. Like, that's not a good part of my life. It's not furthering my goals. And so people that feel more in control actually have a better and healthier relationship with social media than someone that believes that it's addictive and they're out of control. They feel bad when they use it, and they feel like they don't have any way to improve things. So I think that's one of many ways that we can think of interventions to support young people, but also older adults that often report similar things about loneliness in particular. And so I think there's lots of potential there for improving human agency and moving the story away from like, oh, it's the algorithms and they control everything and they determine our lives and they're making me feel bad, to like, no, I'm going to use this as a powerful tool, but a tool to run my life.
So I'm going to ask this one of Will in your hat of as an analysis writer, but it might even be a bridge too far for that. But it's an anonymous question, and it reads: do you think Mark Z is criminally liable? And the other implication is: are there things that down the road have potential for that to happen?
I'm gonna have to pass on the legal question. You know, I guess I would I'd have to know more about which laws, which criminal laws he potentially violated. I think I do have two thoughts that are maybe tangentially relevant. One is, in Europe in particular, there has been a movement to incorporate into the law a concept called duty of care. And this is the idea that companies have a responsibility to society, a legal responsibility to minimize the harms to society. And that if there are foreseeable harms that they know about and they don't take action to mitigate them, I don't think it's criminal, but they could be sued based on that. I think it's an interesting idea. I think it's probably far off from the United States, but it is something that's gaining traction in Europe and the UK. I think it's an interesting thing to consider because, the problem you get into if you try to make laws against this or that in technology is, it's not really, well, I just think there's a neutrality as to the substance of the conduct if you adopt a duty of care standard, that I think could be helpful. My second thought related to this is that I think it does matter who's the leader of a company. It matters the tone they set. It matters the decisions they make. So I do think that Mark Zuckerberg personally bears a lot of responsibility for the bad, some of the bad outcomes of Facebook's pervasiveness. One of the troubling things that I've come to believe in my years of reporting on tech, and not just on Facebook, but on other companies, is that I'll confine this to the social media sector for now. There's a Darwinian element to the competition between social platforms. There are the network effects, the fact that you have to be a certain size to survive, that growth is everything. The business, the ad-supported business, where the amount of time users spend is critical to showing them ads. All of those things militate to make sure that the companies that prioritize growth and engagement over more nebulous concerns about their harms to society are going to be the ones that win. They're going to be the ones that win that battle. And if Facebook were suddenly to fire Mark Zuckerberg and appoint an ethicist to run the company and change everything around and prioritize users' interests over growth, that would be wonderful. I'm sure a lot of harm could be prevented that way. But I also think it might be a relatively short time until some less scrupulous, it would shorten the time scale on which some less scrupulous company would come and depose them and make them go the way of MySpace. I'm not super optimistic, about the potential for ethically run companies to succeed in the unregulated social media environment that we have today.
That's a perfect segue to this audience question that I'll pose to Jeff, and then Georgia, feel free to follow. And the question from the audience member was, in our current system where companies frequently choose profit over care for the public, will we ever have a company that consistently values our digital well-being?
Yeah, to me, the core problem around well-being, certainly, and social media is the business model, and it's advertising. I think that's over 97% of Facebook's income, but every other company too. It's terrible. We get to use all these products for free so that advertising can happen. And I'm not sure that we can solve many of these things if that remains the business model. So I'd be pretty pessimistic there. I do think there's a lot of new things happening. I know you can't really have a conversation without talking about Web3 and NFTs and crypto, but I do feel like there's some cool spaces now where communities are developing, where they are rewarding themselves by having and recognizing contributions to the community, rather than simply saying whatever you want, but actually having value within the community. So as we transition from Web 2.0, the Facebook sort of era, to a place where sort of currency and recognition, authenticity are natively digital, we might be able to solve some of these problems that come out of advertising, where we can recognize contributors in ways without a lot of, the need for advertising. So I remain optimistic in the long term, but in this current model, it's not clear to me how a less scrupulous company, like Will describes, would emerge without being threatened by, more scrupulous without being threatened by the less scrupulous.
Georgia?
Yeah, so I don't have an exact answer, but one thing this inspired me to want to bring up is Pinterest. So many of the teens I spoke with described Pinterest as basically a refuge, like a place that they found quite soothing. And often it would be around kind of different boards related to like house plants, different boards related to like beautiful landscapes. I can't remember some of the others. Like cute, puppy and kitten type stuff. So I think the point was that I don't know if that's the result of kind of any decisions the company made around profit. And I don't think Pinterest is a typical social media company. I think it's much more around social discovery, but that there do exist pockets of what appear to be quite healthy, kind of happy, things in the social media or online app space. But that's not a statement on the ability of companies that prioritize that to be able to get ahead or anything.
So we are approaching the end of our panel. So I'm just going to give each panelist an opportunity to just sort of have a wrap up, maybe share something that you feel is important that we just haven't had a chance to get on the table this evening. Will, maybe start with you.
Sure. So maybe just one thought on that last question. I mean, one of the things that made me have this troubling thought that ethical leadership in the current social media environment is not sustainable was reporting on the leadership change at Twitter. Jack Dorsey stepped down recently and was replaced by one of his deputies, Parag Agrawal. I realize this might sound like I'm saying Parag is not ethical. That's not what I mean to say at all. I don't know that much about Parag. He might be wonderful. But Dorsey was, in part, based on our reporting, it seems like he was at least in part forced out by activist shareholders. They were, Dorsey, there's a lot of bad things you could say about Dorsey, but there's also good things you could say about Dorsey. And one of them is that at Twitter, he invested pretty heavily in recruiting critics of Twitter and critics of social media to come work at the company, and seemed to actually listen to them. I mean, they felt listened to in a way that Facebook's researchers didn't. Again, based on my reporting, other people may have a different view, but he was forced out for not moving quickly enough on product, not hitting the metrics, not growing the bottom line fast enough, too much dithering and hand wringing and navel gazing, so it gave me a dim view of the possibility of ethical tech leadership. I guess the one last thing I'll say, and this is on a different subject, but relative to Facebook and Meta, is that we were talking earlier about the prioritization of growth over other things. There was that famous memo from Andrew Bosworth that was written in 2016. He was a Facebook executive. That was called The Ugly, and it was about how growth was their prime directive. That was their main goal. Everything is justified in the name of growth. Now he says it was just descriptive. He wasn't being normative. He wasn't saying that growth is the only good, but he was saying that this is the reality of this business, is that it's about growth. And he said, this was in 2016. He said somebody will probably die because of one of our products, and still will keep prioritizing growth. And that in fact, people have live streamed, murders and suicides on Facebook Live and such. So I just think it's noteworthy that he is now the person that's been put in charge of their metaverse stuff. So the idea that Facebook is, has learned a big lesson from all this, I think is probably not the case.
Georgia?
So this is more of a question than a conclusion, but what was really notable to me throughout the whole process of this reporting was, more than any other project I've ever worked on, I just was inundated with emails from parents and teens and teachers and all kinds of different people. And one of the through lines, one of the themes from the emails from, in particular, the parents, was around trust. And many of the parents articulated what appeared to be this feeling of broken trust, that the parents appeared to have expected the company, that Facebook would have informed them if it had found a possibility for harm involving their children, and that the company didn't. And so that's one of those emails are the ones that have really stuck with me through this process. And I don't know what to make of them or what that will mean for the industry, if anything, but they're just, they were really powerful.
And Jeff, you have the last word.
Okay, two things. One, when I received a lot of email or hate mail, which is really what it was after the emotional contagion study, similar to Georgia, one of the main through lines was a trust violation in a way. I thought that you were a platform and you were showing me a window into my social world. And actually what I know now is that there's these algorithms making decisions about what I get to see. I don't necessarily see all my friends. Something else is determining it. And so, that leads to pretty major changes into how a company and an organization is viewed. So I think that's an important early sign. The other that I wanted to say I appreciated about this conversation is we haven't talked a lot about screen time. And I think one of the reasons that the research is sort of mixed on well-being and social media is because that's what most people end up focusing on. It's easy to measure. We can kind of count it, but it's pointless. It's like saying, talking too much is bad for you. Well, if we have a nice conversation like this and people say nice things, that's going to be really good for me. If everybody starts yelling at me and telling me that I'm stupid, that's really bad for me. It could be the same amount of time, it's the same medium, but we're ignoring completely the content. And here I thought, especially with George's reporting, focusing in on the mechanisms, for example, social comparison in some instances, and being concrete about, okay, this kind of thing is a problem, rather than being on this thing, the screen for this amount of time is going to be bad. And I think that's where most of the conversation has been held. And actually in Facebook's responses, that's the kind of research they were pointing to. And so I just wanted to say 2 thumbs up. Thank you, Georgia, for that coverage and focusing in on mechanisms and content and moving us away from a screen time argument. It's not helpful for parents or kids, and it's sort of irrelevant and misses the whole point. So thank you for that.
Great. Well, if we were all in an actual room instead of on Zoom, I would ask for a big round of applause for our 3 panelists. So if you can do that virtually, I'm going to do it here. Really appreciate Georgia, Will, and Jeff for taking the time to do this. Thanks to all of you out there for viewing and participating, and have a good night.
Thanks, RB.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.